All right. Hello, Beth Carroll. How are you today?
I'm good, Jared. How are you?
Fantastic. So, Beth Carroll, you're our guest advisor today. Beth is managing principal at Prosperio Group, a consulting group that helps manage compensation in all sorts of spaces. But Beth, I want to give you a quick second to talk about you and your business and what you do.
Yep, absolutely. I am a compensation consultant. Most people don't know that that exists as a thing, but there are probably about 150 people worldwide that just do compensation consulting as their thing. I actually have been trained, certified through World at Work to do. I'm a certified sales compensation professional, a certified compensation professional, and a certified global remuneration professional, which just means I know how to pay people in other countries.
Okay.
So basically what I do is I help companies figure out how to use compensation as a strategic tool to drive performance, increase motivation, increase the return that they get from their compensation spend, which for most of my companies, it's one of their biggest cost items. And so if they can get more bang for their buck, then it's
Yeah.
money well spent.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. I've heard you talk before too, and what I thought was cool at a TA a few years ago when they introduced you, they said they were introducing Beth, who literally wrote the book on compensation in the trade space. I love that because in fact you did write the book.
I did.
I have the book. It's packed somewhere, but it's a great book. I've referenced it a few times in all the different compensation structures that I've personally been a part of in different companies. You have awesome insight. You explain it in a way that I think is relevant, but also important. When you talk about how to achieve a good return on investment for your people versus the compensation that's being paid out, I think super important to understand that there is a return, right? There is a formula that companies should really look to and discuss and plan to, right? So that they don't just come up with a compensation structure that doesn't fit again, their bottom line doesn't fit their profitability structure, all those things. And I think sometimes you can get lost in the numbers. And I think perhaps that's where a lot of companies get confused and lost. All of a sudden, 3 months in, they're writing checks and they realize, oh man, we can't afford this. We're way overpaying what
Right.
we are versus our return on what we're getting. Do you see that a
Yep.
lot?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that stems from one fundamental flaw with the way
Mhm.
compensation plans are designed. And that's people don't define what a goal or an expectation is for a role. They'll actually say, well, we can afford to pay, 30% commission or 25% commission. They'll start with thinking about a commission rate rather than thinking about what's the productivity that they need to get for a particular pay level that's relevant to the market, right? So peg your pay to the market, not necessarily based on a commission rate. So that's where you're likely to see the most runaway costs is when you just have a flat commission rate.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because people may think that's the most sound economical way to develop a compensation plan, but it actually can be one of the worst ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this is maybe the $1 million question. Is there a right way to structure compensation and a wrong way to do it?
Certainly there's more, I would say, wrong methodologies. So there's many different ways to develop incentive compensation plans, from commission plans to goal-based incentives to bounties to banks to all different kinds of things. For some companies, it's perfectly appropriate to have a 50-50 pay mix, which means you've got half of the person's compensation is variable and dependent upon performance. For other companies and roles, it may make more sense to be an 80-20 pay mix. So I think where the mistake really comes in is when you are designing the plan and you haven't really thought through what's your org structure, what are your business objectives, what are your roles and accountabilities and expectations for those roles, and then make sure that the compensation plan aligns to those things. If you start by just saying, well, what should our commission rate be, right? You're not starting in the right place. You're starting at the end of the series of questions that you should do. You really need to begin at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'd say another big mistake is thinking that somebody else's plan will work for you. That is a huge mistake. Just because some XYZ company had fantastic success with a particular compensation plan, I guarantee you the secret sauce isn't the compensation plan. It's how that fit in that organization's culture and worked for that organization. It could be that same plan could be an absolute disaster in another organization.
Yeah. So I have some personal experience with this, having managed, hired, developed compensation plans for multiple different companies. Um, I remember at first, right, in the learning kind of mode of developing compensation, going from one company to the next, I really had that mentality you're talking about. That ended up being, luckily, not disastrous in terms of, hey, we completely destroyed our budget, but it hurt in terms of, no, one, we weren't compensating correctly. Number two, there's an element of trust that's involved, right? As you develop compensation, as you start to roll this out and you talk to people about what you're paying them, people want to trust that. They need to be able to say, hey, my company is going to pay me X. They've already, committed to it. I'm going to do everything I can to achieve those goals based on what they've said. And once you kind of ruin that, it's hard to go back. It's hard to restructure.
Yeah.
And so I've personally been a part of that. And I can tell you, again, no company, going from one group to the next, organization to the next is similar. You might look at it from the outside and say, hey, all the things match up. But again, everybody has different inputs. The outputs are different. Expectations are different. Business, types are different. So as a business leaders, I just echo what you say, because again, I've lived that and have experienced that's, super difficult to, if you have that mentality, number one, shed it, immediately, because it's not the right way to get into it. But think about, again, kind of the end goal, what you're trying to accomplish, and then really work towards the inputs to make that number work.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd say another thing is thinking that compensation is just math, right? So people think about trying to get the economics of it right, and they focus on having like a pure economic relationship. And so if there's like a $2.50 short pay for a load, they're going to say, oh, well, we've got to take that back from the commission that we paid on it. No, you don't. Your commission plan or your incentive plan is really meant to drive performance and drive behavior. It's more of a psychological tool than it is a tool to create a pure economic relationship between you and your employees, or at least that's what it should be.
Right.
And you're all tangled up in your underwear trying to make it into this pure economic relationship that it was never meant to be that.
Yeah. Is it possible to get too defined in how you structure compensation? You brought up a good example of, there's an element to whatever, right? Maybe there's a detention paid, right? Or something that happens, right? That affects, you're right, the bottom line, affects the ultimate profitability of a particular task. When you're developing compensation, can you get too in the weeds with the numbers, or is it best to, target every aspect of what you think could happen and then do that?
I'm going to answer both, right? So when you're developing a compensation plan, you absolutely have to do the economic modeling. You have to make sure that you really understand who's going to be impacted positively and negatively by the change, and that you've built something that is administratable, where you want to make sure that you can actually run the numbers on it, and you can do it in a way that makes sense to people so that they can trust the numbers. So there is a level of this where you do have to be in the weeds, but you also have to continually be able to pull yourself up and think about it from a high level as well. And broadly speaking, is the compensation plan driving the overall business results that you want? And you have to be ready to be able to tweak that. So a lot of building a compensation plan is like gathering tools to build a carpentry project around your house, right? When people just have a straight commission plan, it's like all they have is a hammer.
Yeah.
Well, that's great if all you need to do is pound some nails. But at some point, you're going to need to saw something, right? So you might need to have a saw as well. And so you want to have as many of those tools available as possible. You're not going to use them all at the same time, but you want to be ready with the right tool when the need arises for that. Yeah. So it's getting that balance. Some companies want to use everything, right? Like they'll get this nice new toolbox and they'll have everything out there. And it's like, that's too much. You don't need all of that right now.
Yeah.
Understand what you need when you need it, and be able to have the flexibility enough that you can pivot and change it up, not too frequently, because as you said, with trust, right? Yeah. Anytime you change somebody's compensation plan, they're going to be nervous about that. Yeah. So you have to be very careful when you make those changes, that you're doing it for the right reasons. Strategically, you understand, hopefully it's actually going to make people's pay better if they're doing what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. I never recommend going in and reducing base salaries. That's usually a non-starter from the beginning. Yeah. So just be careful and remember that it's more about psychology than it is about the math.
Yeah, super important. I want to take one step back and ask about your business for a second. Who do you typically who's your typical client base? I mean, obviously, Prosperio Group has a target market. Who are you typically going after? Who should be calling you?
Well, I've built a real niche in the transportation and logistics industry. So as far as I know, I'm pretty much the only person out there who really focuses on doing compensation design for transportation and logistics. There are certainly consultants who focus on the transportation and logistics industry, but they do all kinds of other things, right? So they will do comp design as a piece of their offering. And then there are compensation consultants who may, on occasion, have a transportation and logistics client. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's hit the intersection of those two things, where it's like, this is what I do, this is what I focus on. There's org design work that comes along with it, because you can't do a good compensation plan if you have an unclear org structure and your roles aren't clear. So I do a little bit of org design, but it's never just org design by itself. It's org design on the way to compensation. But my target is anybody who is in the transportation and logistics supply chain space. So whether that's a freight broker, a trucking company, whether it's truckload or LTL, private fleet even, I've done driver comp. So anybody in that world is my target. I will still do projects outside the industry, but I don't really actively market outside.
Yeah, makes sense. The other thing too, I think something about what you said there, when people are engaging, with you and your services, there is a difference between, compensation within an asset, based environment versus a logistics, more of an LSP type environment. Positions not only are different, but expectations perhaps are different. How you interact with your core, customer, again, and, again, what the profit structure, what that, again, what the ROI looks like is different between those types of, businesses. Is that fair to say? And because I think obviously I've worked in both the asset space as well as logistics space, and I know coming from both, there's obviously crossover, but it's important, I think, for leadership to understand that, what you think, might work for one side of your business versus the other. I think you need to rethink that.
Yeah, that's a huge problem when companies have both.
Yeah.
So a lot of trucking companies have a brokerage that's connected to them, or you might have a brokerage that has some freight management kind of stuff, 3PL, or you can have warehousing that has a little bit of all of it in there. And the worst thing to do is to compensate all of them the same way, because they're very different roles. You typically wouldn't pay a load planner the same way you're going to pay a freight broker. Right? It just, they have different objectives, different goals, different accountabilities, different market values out there in terms of the pay for the job. So you really do have to understand the differences. And that's I will do those projects frequently where I've got trucking roles and brokerage roles in the same company. And then you run into the particular challenge of when the asset side has to take a load.
Yeah.
Well, they usually get right of first refusal. So the asset side will pull a load from brokerage, and then how do you figure out how to compensate the folks in brokerage, because usually they're much more heavily incented for that, right? And getting that coordination between the two sides of the house, which are almost always two actual separate legal entities, even though they are working together as the same company, that can be a challenge.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge too for HR groups, I think, as they evaluate compensation structures, as they're recruiting to different, sides of the business, and there becomes an internal competition between, the trucking side and the non-asset side. I think that can sometimes be a barrier internally for those kind of structures. And I think, having, again, the mentality and how you educate internally within those companies, and, hey, this is the asset side of business. It's different from the non-asset side. As you evaluate what comp is going to look like, it's going to look different from what we do on this side versus this side. But I think it's important as you're allocating time to coming up with a compensation structure, you really take time to educate all those parties involved, because again, if you get into it, and you have, let's say, the sales management on one side, you have operations management, you have the asset side versus a non-asset side, and also you bring in shared, resources like legal groups or HR groups. Man, if you don't have those people already engaged, it can really slow down the process and coming up with a good comp structure.
Yeah, so it is very important to have all of those different parties as part of the discussion, because you've got some really different perspectives. from HR, from sales leadership, finance, and accounting. And so usually I recommend pulling a design team together to get all of those different perspectives. A lot of what I do is really about building consensus and doing, it's almost a little like, I liken it sometimes like marriage counseling, particularly like two brothers running the company, which I run into a lot. Usually they have very different opinions about how things should be run. And so I am often like a referee between them.
Yep.
And helping them sort of sort through, one feels it should be this way and the other feels it should be this way. And then if you can throw in like a sales leader and a CFO in the mix, they're definitely going to have different opinions. Yeah. And so, but you get a much better result, even if everybody has to compromise a little bit in terms of what they want. If all of those leaders at the end of the day agree on what you've come up with, you are going to have a much better outcome from a, let's say, a 70% good compensation plan that has 100% agreement than if you had 100% good compensation plan with 70% agreement.
Yeah. Wow, that's super important. I really, that what you just said there was incredibly important. Is there do you have a game plan? Is there something that you say as you go into an opportunity to, again, evaluate compensation? Do you have like a kind of a checklist of, hey, let's make sure these people are involved. Let's make sure we understand, this part about their business. Is that something that as a compensation consultant you do?
Yep. I have done this process over 300 times. So I've worked with over 300 companies, and many of those companies I've had multiple projects with. So typically at the beginning, there's always an interview process and sort of a fact-finding process that I go through. But I basically want to make sure that I'm getting input from leaders and as well as individual contributors, so that I get some sense of really what the people that are in the trenches, how do they feel about their roles and responsibilities, and how do they think the current compensation plan is working. It's not always possible. Sometimes management wants to make these changes sort of hush hush because they're afraid they're going to upset the apple cart. You're going to upset it one way or the other, right? So my preference is always to be more transparent and to let people know we're gathering their feedback as part of this process. We care about what they think. We want them to have input, not just something we're going to go into a back room and figure out and then impose upon them. Let's get their perspective on it.
The empathy part there is super important, having that awareness when you're dealing with compensation and even at the management level, the structure level. I mean, there are people involved, there's livelihoods involved. As you're, again, as leadership, as you're walking through it, having that sense of awareness to who this will impact, I think is important from, just from a kind of a personal level.
Right. You have to know that changing somebody's compensation is incredibly personal, right? People attach a value to how much money they make. Like they feel like that says something about the worth of them as a human being. It doesn't, right? Obviously we know that, but people feel that way about it. And so that's why I almost never recommend cutting somebody's salary, because people attach that meaning to their salary. And so even if they can make it up from an incentive perspective, and even if you can show them that they're going to make more from their incentive, when you cut their salary, your implied message to them is they are less valuable to you. And that's really hard to overcome once you've done that.
It's definitely hard to put that cat back in the bag when you've already done something. I do think you're right. I think, again, just from the perspective of, luckily in all of my years, we've never had to really restructure compensation plan dramatically, where either we've cut compensation, wholly, or, really cut people's, bottom, the salaries and whatnot. Because I do think, at least from my standpoint as a leader, I think it's imperative that you do understand all the things you just touched on, right? Which is, sure, you can look at it as a financial, you can look at it on a financial, sheet and say, hey, these are the numbers. But at the end of the day, those numbers actually represent people in a way. And that's the way that whoever receives that message will ultimately see it as, hey, you've attached a certain, monetary value to who I am as a person and what I can provide to you as a company. And most companies don't want to, they're not needing to say it that way. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how the people on the end that's receiving the, the information and the news will see that.
Now, obviously, if there's extraordinary economic times like what we've just been through,
Yeah.
and people wholesale need to take reductions and pay to keep the company alive,
Yeah.
that's a different story. But obviously, and we've all seen some good examples of companies that have done that well and companies that have done that poorly. It's got to start with leadership, right? If that's what's going on with your organization, if your leaders aren't taking pay cuts, visible big pay cuts first, don't even begin to ask your people to do it, right? They may stick with you until we get to the other side of this, and then they're all going to be gone.
Yeah.
And you will have destroyed morale and destroyed any hope that you have of having a strong workforce going forward.
It's a culture killer for sure. You actually wrote at the time of when we're talking now. You just recently wrote something that you posted on LinkedIn and on your website about compensation post-COVID, right, or this time of COVID. And I want to maybe talk about, because we've really seen three types of three types of years. We had 2018, which was,
good year,
a great year for most freight companies. You had 2019, which was somewhat of a mixed bag. You had probably, for half of everybody was doing really well, and then maybe half the year it really started to kind of tank. And now 20, we have a pandemic, and we're kind of now recovering out of the pandemic. We're kind of post-pandemic a little bit, but obviously we're going to be, feeling the results of COVID now for a while. How should, what's your maybe advice on companies trying to steer themselves through really, such a dynamic and such, volatile time, especially when it comes to compensation?
Well, it's a good time to step back and think about, are your plans helping when you've got volatility out there, or are they hurting you? And straight commission plans are going to be the most volatile in terms of payouts. They're going to track right? So it's going to go up, it's going to go down.
Yeah.
If you have more heavily goal-based or fixed expectation type plans, those are going to be more manageable from a cost perspective. You can also, if you don't already have it, you can also institute something called a year-end true-up. And basically what that does is it caps any individual month or quarter's payout. And it says at the end of the year, we're going to do a look back, and we're going to then do a makeup over the whole year. We're going to figure out, based on the whole year's performance, what the payout should have been for the whole year. If there's a positive balance, we're going to pay it at the end of the year. So what that does is it just kind of takes out the peaks and the valleys in it. So if they had 1 month where it just stunk and they didn't make anything, they might have a chance to earn something back.
Yeah.
At the end of the year. It becomes really important when your plan has a concept of a threshold in it, where there's a point below which no incentive pay is earned, right? If they got nothing because they missed the threshold by a little bit in that month, that true up gives them the chance to get it back. And it takes out some of those really extreme peaks. If you have an uncapped plan that says, we want to pay you a lot of money. If you had a fantastic year, I'm all for paying you a ton of money, but I'm not necessarily all for paying it in 1 month because we had some, toilet paper shortage.
Right.
Have, Procter and Gamble is your account. So,
Yeah, when cycles like this, numbers tend to become, unreliable, right? Because 1 month, if like in, May and June, for example, this year, man, it's going to be dynamite, right? But that's not going to be a fair, baseline to months either previous or months upcoming, because it's just, again, you just can't, they're not comparable. Year over years aren't comparable. In this case, probably month over month won't be comparable anymore either, just based on the volatility, what's going on.
Right. It makes goal setting very challenging. It's very hard to do goal setting.
Yeah. So do you see a lot of companies right now reevaluating compensation, or are they, have you seen, at least some responsible leadership in terms of, hey, let's we're being transparent with our people, and let's maybe restructure temporarily, but hey, this is why we're doing it.
Yep. I heard one company actually got rid of all incentives altogether. I'm not advocating that, but I did hear the rumor that one company out there has gone full salary for everybody and just taken away all incentives.
Yeah.
And that, that's not an uncommon response to the times that we're going through, where they're just like, oh my God, we can't manage this. It's too crazy. Let's just stop.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, heck, I've been in a situation myself. You'd much rather, I think, as a person, as an employee, for a company to come out and say, hey, this is the situation that we're in. These are obviously uncertain economic times. the company itself, yeah, we might be having XYZ issues. In order to help us get through this, we're going to, right, we're going to stop incentive plans. We're going to, go to a straight base salary, perhaps revisit in the future without giving away too much or setting unrealistic expectations. But at least, again, at least they have jobs. At least they have the ability to provide for their families. Hopefully, help the company, stay afloat through the process, but also still at least have some, some certainty around their life situation.
Ultimately, that goes away. Ultimately, once things return to normal,
Yeah.
companies are going to say, well, why aren't my employees motivated? It's like, well, because they don't have an incentive plan, right? Their job now is just to not lose their job.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Eventually, the goodwill kind of runs out, right?
Yeah, it does. It does.
You can't use that excuse forever. You got to be able to, again, kind of get yourself out of it. And again, especially if you're on the front line and you're making sales, you're talking to drivers or whatever it may be, they're going to see, hey, our business seems really robust right now. I really feel like, hey, we should be getting our incentives back.
Right. More than just my salary. Yep. An interesting trend that I think that I'm watching to see how this plays out is having more employees work from home.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that do from an incentive design perspective and from a salary perspective?
Yeah. Is there a trade-off? Do employees is there some sort of trade-off for employees? Hey, I want the flexibility to work from home. I'll give up X to do that. Or
They certainly could be, right? Because now you're in the realm of changing the total rewards package.
Mm-hmm.
So you're changing the deal. You're changing the deal that you have with your employee. If they're able to work from home, that reduces some of their out-of-pocket costs. They don't have commuting costs. They won't have dry cleaning costs. Like if they had dry cleaning costs, most of my clients are not wearing clothes.
They're wearing flip-flops in shorts.
Right. That doesn't change anything. But if you did have to dry clean, you probably don't have to do that as much anymore. And just time, the time factor that you gain back by being able to be at home. For some people, that's going to be very valuable, and they may be willing to give up something for that. For others, it's not going to be so valuable. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to, figuring out how do you craft something that is going to be flexible enough that's going to fit different employee needs. Because I know coming out of this, some employees are just, were dying to get back into the office. They just could not stand working from home. Yeah. And others of them are like, I don't ever want to go back.
Don't send me back.
I really have a life and I'm more productive. I can get more done, because I'm not spending time doing stupid things all day and with coworkers and all that kind of stuff. So I think companies need to get some level of flexibility, and it can go along with different compensation arrangements for those people, depending on whether they're work from home or whether they're in the office.
Yeah. Well, I think to kind of piggyback on that is that when you're talking about making maybe small manipulations to overall compensation, like for example, outside salespeople, right, who either receive a car allowance, maybe they do mileage reimbursement, maybe could be multiple things that are involved in total compensation for an outside salesperson. In a time right now where no one's receiving, right, you're not going to see people face to face right now. You maybe not be, flying and per diems and all this stuff. Those are, I think, can be small things you can do in the interim, right, as you're trying to, fix your financials, or at least realign yourself. That little small things, I think, that can make a big impact without disrupting as a whole everything that's going on within your compensation in general.
Right, exactly.
So we had 2018, 2019, 2020. Anecdotally speaking, right, I've heard from a lot of people, because I think this is an important part that you brought up, which is there's a trade-off between people that are going to work and then people wanting to be home. Anecdotally, I'm waiting to see numbers come out on this. I think this will be a really important data set. But there are a lot of people talking about, hey, since my people have been working from home, I've seen some of our core metrics, our KPIs, really improve on certain things. And I wonder if that would continue. Some of the folks that I've talked to, a lot of people are coming back into the office now. Some are still at home. But I wonder how that would have played out, over a year, over a 12-month period, if they would have seen year-over-year growth in some of the key metrics had they been allowed to stay out of the office and work from home. And then put that in terms of the conversation around the trade-offs between people being home versus, being forced to come back into the office.
I think it would. So I have worked from home I was one of the first consultants to push for working from home when I was with the big HR consulting firm. I had
Mhm.
to. I came into the firm with a 2.5-year-old, and which was unheard of at the time. And
Right.
I had 2 more babies while I was there, and I kept working. I didn't have a choice. So I've always been the primary breadwinner in my family. So this was not an option for me to take, to do the mommy thing.
Yeah.
Couldn't. So I said, well, if this is going to work for me, I'm going to have to be able to be at home. And so I just kind of did it. I forced them to accept it. I did good enough work that they didn't want to get rid of me. So it's
Right.
like, well, if you want to keep her, then this is sort of what the deal is. So
Yeah.
I think employees have to recognize that that's got to be a piece of it as well. It's
Mhm.
like companies aren't going to keep you around if you're not providing value to them. But if you are providing value, and I think many employees will find that they can even provide more value if the work from home environment is right for them, then companies would be silly to
Yeah.
just not take that when they have it available.
Mhm.
So I think for some people, it's not going to be right for everybody. But for some people, it can actually unleash an additional amount of potential that they didn't have before, because now you're taking away a whole variety of conflicts that were constantly gnawing on them from a psychological perspective.
Yeah.
That now you've given them that, hey, I can, have lunch with my kids and I can be a part of their life. And it's not, with me personally, there has never been a particular line between my home life and my work life.
Mhm.
Like the two things are completely enmeshed and have been back practically now as long as I can remember, where I closed a deal from the middle of Prague Square when I was traveling with my high school senior at the time, my oldest child. We were in Prague and I had to take a business call, and he went off and was checking something out for a while, and I closed a deal. So
Yeah.
I've been back to Prague a couple times, and every single time I've closed a deal in Prague. So
Lucky place then.
yeah, it must be a lucky place. But like my kids got very used to that with me, that it's like that I'll do trips with them, all kinds of wonderful trips, but I'll have to do a conference call while, they're sleeping in the bed next to me in the hotel room and I'm on the phone, doing a conference call.
Yeah.
They're just used to it. But it's like, it's given me a lot of flexibility. So I think if people can trust their employees enough to be good workers and to provide them with the motivation, right, from your incentive compensation plan
Mhm.
to drive them to want to succeed, then I think it can be a really good situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have been maybe, 2 years ago, maybe I would have been one of those leaders that would have said, I don't know if we're ready for this. I'm not sure. I don't know if it was a trust factor. I don't know if it was just because, as a sales professional for a long time, I worked from home. But as a leader, sometimes you're like people all together in a space and you feel like there's a dynamic there that helps your business. And that's probably partially true in some cases. But what I think has,
Well, manager's employee.
helped through this or through this kind of time is that there's a new normal.
Mhm.
I'm on a phone call with the bank or, with somebody I'm getting information from and I'm talking to them, a customer service person, and I hear their dog in the background or I hear their kid, man, there was no part of me that said, oh man, this is super unprofessional. I'm not going to talk to these people anymore, or I want to take my business elsewhere. No, it just became new. It just became normal. And there's something almost endearing about it where, hey, this person's working. They're obviously have a life. They have there's something personal, I think, about it, which was an interesting dynamic that maybe we were all introduced to, that we've all now learned that, hey, we can thrive and operate in this environment. And you know what? I think we're going to be okay. Our business is going to be okay. Our people seem to be okay. And again, back to the anecdotal evidence, I think, we're still meeting our sales. We're still meeting all of
Right.
our core metrics. We're going to be just fine.
Yeah, and I think people are finding they can do it in a lot less time.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm hearing, is like they are more productive than they were before. They're getting things done quicker and faster and better than they did it before. But you're exactly right. I mean, as I said, I've worked from home my entire time running Prosperio. I've been home based.
Mm-hmm.
So for 12 years, I used to hide it. I used to, like, my kids would know, like, you can see the door behind me right here. Like, I would do this,
Yeah.
right, to
Yeah.
go
Go
away.
back. Go
And
back.
I was on the call, go back, go back, go back.
Yeah.
And now it's like, I love it that now I don't have to worry about that anymore, because nobody has any expectation.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, you're probably going to hear my dog bark in the background, like
Right.
if he comes to the door. And that's now normal. Whereas I used to feel like ashamed, like I'm not a real professional because I am working from a home office.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, again, the dynamics and how leadership looks at that will completely change. So I think from that aspect, I think there's some good that will come out of it for sure. Because I do think, now that I work from home and have that opportunity, again, I think there's a huge trade-off for a lot of people that they will be willing to, trade in order to have the convenience of being home, not have to drive, all that stuff.
Hey, I'll give you a pro tip though, for you and all your listeners. After years of this, family members don't respond well to that. You're better off with this kind of emotion. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You can be like my daughter and put a little sign on the door that says "Daddy's working," and or if the door's closed, don't come in, whatever. It's
exactly.
So when we're talking about compensation, there's a lot of things. One of the things that I like that, and we probably don't have time to go through all the dynamics of this, but you have on your website, right? I've heard you talk about this. Is the rule of 78.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is important when we talk about expectations for people as you're bringing on new people into roles or devising compensation for people in roles. Because again, you can get it really screwed up if you have an expectation. Hey, this person can bring on 12 new accounts, month one. That means that equates to X amount month 12.
Right.
You brought up a good point that I think many people lose sight of, and that is not every month is equal. Not every output of every month is equal in terms of what employees can do within a certain amount of time period. How important is that? Again, I know that we talked about expectations a little bit already, but there's specific rules around how to devise compensation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any kind of general rules like the rule of 78 that people can go to and say, hey, I'm going to make sure I understand this about compensation?
Yeah, I think that's a good one, and I'm not going to try to go into it now because it's pretty esoteric.
Go to your website because there's a huge chart you have, which is great information, but it's I had to read it 3 or 4 times to get it.
Yeah, to explain it. But I would say probably the most important thing is to understand you need 3 levels to setting expectations. You need threshold, the point at which, no pay is earned below that, or said positively, the point at which incentive pay starts. You need target, which would be where they're earning their target level of pay. And then you need excellence, which would be your top 10%. So, and you can use your historical data to find out where that bell curve, basically what that typically looks like. And that should guide you in terms of setting your performance ranges for your compensation plan. And you should have something meaningful happen at those 3 points. Threshold is easy because that's where the pay turns on. But something should happen at target. It shouldn't just be more of the same.
Mm-hmm.
You should get a higher commission rate, or your slope changes. Something happens at target. And then something else happens at excellence. It doesn't necessarily mean it caps, but something should happen there as well. There's a reason why airline companies and, car rental companies and hotel chains always have, bronze, silver, gold, platinum, ambassador, elite, whatever, right? It's because they want to give you another level to try to shoot for. Yeah. You need to have the same sort of thing going on in your compensation plan.
We talk about compensation for salespeople or any type of compensation that's base plus incentive. How do you keep people motivated? How do you have a career path? How does that look? It seems to me that that's always a big hurdle to overcome, is be able to show within a certain your certain organization that there's a career path even for incentive-based employees.
Mm-hmm. Well, you want to think about your bigger populations. So, and that's going to typically be like carrier sales, driver managers, load planners, customer service reps, those kinds of things. You want to think about creating at least 3 career levels, right? So customer service 1, customer service 2, customer service 3 kind of thing. And with that career progression, it's not just about spending time in the position, but you want to put some performance standards around it that are both qualitative and quantitative. Obviously, you're going to look at output, but you want to put some other qualitative factors around. And when they get that promotion, they should see a change in their salary or their base hourly rate. They should also see an increase in their incentive pay as well, as long as they maintain the productivity standards. If you give them a promotion and they actually fall backwards in terms of productivity, they should actually make less money at the higher level, because now that's not standard performance anymore.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of the biggest things that I do for my clients, is help them put in those career levels.
Yeah. Good. And I think, again, you learn, you learn by doing a lot of times. And this is why, when people are coming up with compensation structures, I've learned the hard way, hey, hire people like Beth who can help you through this, because you can avoid a lot of the big pitfalls. But measurements as you're progressing from, carrier 1, carrier 2, carrier 3, whatever it may be, need to be qualitative and quantitative, right? And it can't just be, I'm going to increase your incentive, because not everybody sees it that way, right? But at least in my experience, having a bump in base salary, and then an expectation of, hey, based on this bump, there's going to be extra incentive requirements or expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, just giving people a title based on, like you said, longevity or something, or some other kind of undefined, reason. That's not a career path. That's not something that people, I think, value in positions like that.
Right. No, you want it to be merit-based. People have a really good sense of when things are unfair.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody gets rewarded for just showing up, that's, none of us like that. None of us like the trophy generation stuff that has happened. And so it needs to be performance-based. It needs to be based on, but not just production. That's a problem that a lot of companies make, is they forget that they can wrap other things into the promotion. And you brought up a point about having the salary increase and then having different expectations from the incentive. Absolutely, that should happen. You should have a higher threshold when you've gone to the higher level. But you don't want to hardwire those two things together. You don't want to say, because we raised your salary, now your threshold has gone up as a specific mathematical function of your salary, because now you've just taken away all psychological benefit from giving that salary increase.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. I just got that. You're right. And I think in the past, I've probably done that wrong myself. Tying both of those together again, which is, connecting those.
Logically, you're right.
Yeah.
They do go together, but you don't want to create the mathematical link to them.
Right. Yeah. Because in some ways you might de-incentivize someone having that next career path. If you also way out of whack in incentives, I don't want to go from carrier 1 to carrier 2, because also I'm going to slide backwards. It's not going to help me, except for maybe a bump in salary. But the incentive program would be so, crazy that I won't be able to achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
What other pitfalls should groups be when you're talking to them, when they call you up and say, hey, I need help, Beth, I've seen your content, I need help. What are some of the pitfalls, other things you would advise companies against or help them through?
Not taking it seriously. I'd say that's probably the biggest one. They think they can, that they can do it cheaply and quickly and not really have to put a lot of energy and effort into the process. And that's a huge mistake. Yeah. So this is a big deal. Changing people's compensation is a big deal. And if you aren't willing to spend the money and the time to address it and take it seriously, then it's going to blow up in your face, and you're probably better off not doing anything at all. So I think that's one of the biggest pitfalls. Another pitfall is changing it too quickly, right? So you go through all the energy and effort to design the compensation plan. There's two types of people. There's people that are just impatient, right? And they may say, well, after 1 month, well, it didn't have the desired effect, so I'm just going to pull it. It takes time. It takes a while for them to understand how the compensation plan works, and you have to continually reinforce it with them. You have to teach them about it. That takes at least 2 full pay cycles. So the impatient person is the one type who's going to change it too fast. And then there's the tinkerer, right? There's the person who's got this new set of tools, and they're so enamored with all the tools, they just want to use all the tools, right? And so they're going to tinker with the compensation plan, every month or so, and try to make something change and different and better. And they think they're making it better, but we're not talking about widgets here. We're talking about human beings who react a particular way to change. Right. And if you change things too much, too frequently, they're going to shut down, right? They're going to just be like, I don't care anymore. I don't care what you're doing to me. So even if you really love these tools, you have to learn to just leave them alone for a little while. You've built your thing, let it sit, let it run, see what happens, see what works and what doesn't work. and then make some changes. You should be changing your plan every year, not massive changes, right? But you should be doing little fine tuning, and your people should expect that, and then bigger changes about every 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
But you should not be changing it every month or
So
even every
year to year over year, kind of iterational type stuff on your current program.
Exactly, because you're adjusting it to meet your strategy. And that's sort of an expectation. What's going to be the new comp plan for the year kind of thing. Don't swing people from pillar to post on this, though. Make tweaks.
Right. So I'll add one more pitfall just because I think it's important. Again, as someone who's been in those seats that have devised compensation plans, and I say this to, those who are listening, obviously, this. But one of the big, I think, pitfalls, right, is believing that you can do it yourself. I've been in seats, I've been in groups where we have, the CFO involved, we have the president involved, we have all the kind of the key parties around the table talking about compensation and what we should do, how it should be structured. At the end of the day, though, because you're dealing with not only something finite and important as, money within your company, right, the actual financial stability of your company, but you're dealing with a finite, capital, personal capital, human capital, with people whose lives you are adjusting in some way. And so thinking you can do it on your own, or that you have the ability, maybe the ability's there, but I think sometimes the outsider view,
the perspective,
is important when conceptualizing how people should be, again, compensated for the work that they do. So not hiring people like you, Beth, to help in that process. Mm-hmm. Because again, without that outsider view, without that agnostic view to what you're doing, you can really tangle, differing perspectives, differing motivating factors within a single company. I think again, my advice is bring in someone like Beth who can help devise the strategy, because you'll never get a second chance to make that, that work within your company. Once you lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Well, what else? We're running up on our time here, but is there anything else that you think is important to talk about? Anything that you would either give advice to or say to those who are either talking about internally their compensation strategy, or just times in general right now, especially with all the kind of the craziness that's happening all around us? Anything else you want to tell us?
I would say just keep in mind that yes, money, all of us are running companies, and we have to make sure that we are financially solvent and sound and making profits and all of those kinds of things. But don't lose sight of the fact that you are talking about human beings, right? That's a piece of it. And take into account that psychology.
Yeah.
They're not
quotient involved there, man.
Right.
Can be quantified how important I think that is.
And that they're not all the same. Right? So different things motivate different people. And so you really have to think about the heterogeneous mix that you have of individuals. Some people are going to be motivated by salary. Some people are going to be motivated by title increase. Some people want to become managers. Some people just want to make a ton of money. You have to create a system that's going to pull on all of those different levers to really get the best out of your workforce, because there's not one type of person out there. You're not going to get a room full of never enough hunters. You might like that, but it doesn't exist. Yeah. So you have to make sure you can motivate the rest of the people.
Yeah. One more thing, as you were talking, because I think this is important, right? You have individual contributors. You have people who are who have direct impact on whatever the levers that they're pulling within that sales cycle. But you also have people who are supporting, right? You have that support staff, the support roles that are helping sales positions. I think it's important, and maybe you could piggyback on this too, but I think it's important to recognize those persons along in that compensation cycle. However you decide to do it, if they're supporting those roles, in my view at least, that they should have at least they should at least see the impact that they're having in terms of some sort of compensation or monetary factor.
Typically it's smaller and typically it's team-based, but absolutely those roles need to be included as well.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, Beth, I really appreciate your time. You did a fantastic job. Man, I've learned tons. Again, where can they find you? Where do people need to reach out to you to get your help?
Beth.Carroll, 2 R's, 2 L's in Carroll @prosperiogroup.com is my email. You can also reach me through prosperiogroup.com, my website. There's various ways you can book a call with me. If you want to just go ahead and set up time to talk, I've got a book a call with Beth link, or you can submit a request through the website as well.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put on in the show notes there all the links to your different profiles so that everybody knows where to find you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Beth. Appreciate it.